This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
When you're ready to pop the question, the last thing you want to do is second-guess the ring. At BlueNile.com, you can design a one-of-a-kind ring with the ease and convenience of shopping online. Choose your diamond and setting. When you find the one, you'll get it delivered right to your door. Go to BlueNile.com and use promo code LISTEN to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. That's code LISTEN at BlueNile.com for $50 off your purchase. BlueNile.com, code LISTEN.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, welcome. Today, big changes on the horizon for food imports. I'm in Dover, where they're on the brink of introducing physical checks for certain foods and plants coming in from the EU for the first time in more than 30 years.
Before Brexit, we had total free movement.
So, physically, does that just mean so trucks are essentially just waved on through, or...?
Absolutely. There was no checks at all, except for there's various security agencies involved with intelligence checks, contraband smuggling, people smuggling, obviously.
I'm in the back of a white Land Rover, one of the old school classic types, being driven by, I have to say, an impeccably dressed customs agent. I've come to meet him because, like several other people, he's concerned about the way these controls have been brought in. These are big changes that have been delayed several times, and it's not surprising when you start to see just how complex it is and how this new customs border has been put together effectively from scratch over the past few years. We're heading up the cliffs because I've been told to understand this story, I've got to watch the trucks rolling off the back of the ferries at the port.
We've just had a ferry dock, a DFDS, and what we're going to hopefully see is how quickly they want to get these vehicles off the ship and how quickly the port wants to get those out of the dock. They don't want them in the way at all.
Sandy, who, like Sting or Bono, goes by just one name, has worked in Dover since the late 70s. Most of that time, he's been with one customs agency, Martin Trucks, where he's co-director. And I can see on the water more ferries waiting to come in.
Now the weather's cleared, you can see how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all heading in this direction.
And in terms of turnaround, how quickly will they want to be unloaded and reloaded back up?
I believe they're trying to get them away in 40 to 50 minutes to unload and load.
Around 30% of the food we eat in the UK comes from the EU, and a big proportion comes in on these ferries. Before Brexit, there were no checks on EU food, although, as Sandy explained, Border Force officials are looking for suspicious loads. Now, 4 years after the UK left the EU, controls are being introduced. From midday on April 30th, all food and plants classed as high risk will face inspections. Those are mostly live animals and plants, while a percentage of those foods deemed to be of medium risk will also be checked. Food classed as medium risk are many chilled and frozen foods of animal origin, including meat, fish, eggs, and raw milk. The government told us it plans to take a pragmatic approach to bringing in these checks, and somewhere between 1% and 30% of the goods coming in will be checked. But as we're going to hear, there are still fears about costs rising, unnecessary delays, potential for more fraud and criminal activity, and lapses in biosecurity.
They are creating a door that isn't currently there, and that doorway will enable food from the rest of the world to be able to come here and land at Dover and drive straight out without any control whatsoever.
Lucy Manzano has been head of Dover Port Health Authority for almost 20 years. Her team worked to stop anything that could cause harm to the public and the environment from coming into the country.
So I think it's really important to remember that there have always been controls at the border for rest of world. The changes that we are facing are that for the first time, food that arrives from the EU, certain foods, will also be required to be checked. And the purpose of those checks, like all checks, are to keep us safe and to identify anything that might be non-compliant.
Since Brexit, food that is classed as more risky from non-EU countries has had to arrive at other ports because Dover didn't have a border control post, i.e. the official facilities to do the checks. But that's about to change, and it's the decision over where to locate this border control post that's brought me to be standing watching lorries on the Dover cliffs.
Until the 9th of November, we had planned our border control post, Bastion Point, constructed to carry out the controls at the point they arrive. That is the basic principle of border controls. On the 9th of November, DEFRA announced that border control post would not be opening, and instead they would be opening a border control post inland 22 miles away.
That facility, which we're going to hear more about, is in Sevington and is controlled by Ashford Borough Council rather than Dover.
Now, the problem is that they haven't explained what will stop that food from simply driving into GB and ending up on our plates without any controls whatsoever. And what we've seen in the last few years since we've left the European Union is an increase in non-compliance at the border.
So from a practical perspective, what's going to happen to Bastion Point? Is it redundant now?
So we have been told that Bastion Point will be maintained in a state of non-operational readiness. So it is being maintained to temperature.
You're joking.
No, that is what we have been advised for the last 2 years. We have been lobbying government to open the border control posts because it assists us in, for example, our African swine fever work, which we currently do on the side of the tourist lanes. So we might find a lorry or a coach, for example, that is full of illegal meat. Now, that is not the most appropriate place to be seizing meat. You would expect them to go up to the border control post and to be contained within it, because it's all about stopping the spread of disease.
DEFRA, the Government Department for Food and Rural Affairs, told us it had considered both Bastion Point and Sevington as locations for the border control post. But 2 sites are not necessary to do the number of checks they're expecting, and running Bastion Point would cost an additional £7 million a year, a cost which would be passed on to traders. I wanted to see for myself the route the trucks will take to travel that 22 miles from Dover Port to Sevington, where the border control post is. For our road trip, we're being joined by Kate Wright, a food importer from Gloucestershire. Her family business, Henryson Foods, supply ingredients to companies who make ready meals, bakery and sandwiches. So things like this. So I've got a tuna mayo sandwich.
Yeah, sure. So we bring in tuna from Ecuador, so that's not EU, but yes, we do tuna.
And I've got an egg and cress sandwich.
Yeah, we do lots of boiled and peeled eggs. Because obviously if you're a manufacturer and you're making huge quantities of sandwiches, you're not going to sit there shelling eggs all day. It's a complete waste of time.
So we've got a chorizo, andouja and mozzarella sandwich.
We do bacon, not chorizo. We tend to do the things that we know 100% everyone is using. The UK is a net importer of so many foods because we don't produce enough for our domestic market. People always say, well, we want British eggs, and I totally understand that, but the fact of the matter is we don't produce enough on the island, so we have to import a certain amount.
Kate's been planning these changes for years. The first big part of which started in January, when health certificates started being needed for many foods she imports from the EU. So, how are her suppliers dealing with it all?
I think it is a massive administrative headache for everyone, and I don't really think there are any winners in this. It puts them under a huge amount of time constraint because all of a sudden they've got to produce loads of documentation 48 hours before goods are loaded. So you're moving your whole production schedule earlier, and bearing in mind when you're dealing in a short shelf life product, that's not good, because then it means you're saying to your customers, sorry, you used to get it with 10 days life on delivery, but now we can only do 7 days life on delivery.
Have they been able to complete the paperwork? Have you had some suppliers who've said no, they're no longer going to deal with the UK?
Everybody's been able to do it, but it has been more of a struggle for some people than others, as you would expect. Brexit has definitely favoured larger companies, people with deeper pockets. Medium and small businesses just don't have that, but we still have to comply with all the same regulations. You know, it's not that you suddenly have all this free time to look at Brexit. You already had a job, which was, you know, doing accounts or whatever, and now you're having to deal with huge amounts of regulation that nobody's helping you with. You've just got to go and learn about yourself.
Do you not feel fully trained by DEFRA?
Do you know, back in 2019, I put myself on a 5-day BTEC about import and export procedures because I knew I would have to understand what was coming up, and I didn't feel confident in DEFRA.
And what about cost? Are you clear with how much it's going to cost to import at the end of April? So, yes, we know the cost, as in we know that they've said it's a cap on 145 quid per consignment for medium risk goods. That's fine, I understand that. But those aren't the costs that are the ones that will really hurt businesses. The ones that really hurt are the ones like we've actually already had. In 2022, I had a 9% increase from my haulier in all their costs. In 2023, I had a 5% increase. So that's massive. I looked at our accounts for 2023. We spent £20,000 last year just on customs paperwork. And those are costs that we didn't have before. Having the customs paperwork isn't adding more value to the product. It's just getting it over the border. And in your business, who does pick up the cost?
Well, we pick up some of it and we pass it on to the customer because we deal in commodities. So these aren't things with huge profit margins in the first place. It's not like in fashion where maybe you can say, okay, this designer means that you can automatically slap on a 40% profit margin because they're so, you know, wonderful. In commodities, an egg is an egg. You know, people aren't going to pay more for a free-range boiled egg from this place than from this place. Not huge amounts more anyway. So your margins are already low to begin with.
Do you have an estimation of how much it's going to cost you per order, per load?
Well, it will vary because, for example, one of the things I import is omelettes. So everything has a different commodity code. That is a unique reference that everything has. It's a harmonised system throughout the globe. So we're all using the same 6 digits for every single item. With the commodity codes, cheese omelette will have a different one to a plain omelette, to a different one to a spinach omelette, a cherry pancake. So for that kind of thing, I will have a lot of commodity codes. But obviously, if I'm just bringing in a truckload of boiled eggs, that's one commodity code. So I will only have to pay £29 for that whole lorry. So it depends how diverse your load is. And that's why, again, Brexit is really working against choice. It rewards you for buying large amounts of one thing.
So bulk food.
Indeed, yeah, exactly.
Tasty. DEFRA told us it looked at various options for these changes, which it says are necessary to cover the cost of running the border control facility, including charging per inspection or charging by weight. They say they decided on charging per type of item to keep the rates as low as possible for businesses of all sizes. We leave the cliffs and head back towards the port, and Sandy offers to take us to the facility Lucy told us about, the one that's not planned to be used for the border control checks. It's a 10-minute drive on a huge out-of-town shopping estate.
So we've just gone past the back of Bastion Point, so you can see it just looks like a very, very large warehouse. And when we go around the other side, you'll see how many doors there are for different bays, so they can accommodate several different vehicles.
And is it currently closed?
Yeah. Totally operational, we understand, so I don't know if the fridges and the chilled areas and whatever are all taking up lots of electricity, but...
I'm just quite surprised that it's not more contained, you know, at the border. Yeah. I'm so surprised that you're able to come into open road. Yeah. Even at this point, I mean, from an outsider, I don't really see that much difference between coming here versus going to Sevington, to be honest. They're both open road. Of course, there are Border Force teams within the port looking for suspicious loads. But at the moment, it's not clear what happens to goods that don't show up for checks when asked. DEFRA told us this is something they're currently developing with the relevant authorities. Last week, the Cold Chain Federation, which represents temperature-controlled suppliers, wrote to the government calling for these measures to be delayed, saying they'll lead to price rises and delays for businesses. It also questioned just how ready the border control post facilities are because of the staff shortages and what it calls unfinished infrastructure.
So we've got the ambient stable here.
What about other businesses? Before travelling to Dover, I went to a warehouse run by a Spanish importer based in South London.
Brindisa is an importer and distributor of Spanish food exclusively. So our suppliers consolidate in Spain, and we have 2 trucks a week, at least.
Brindisa has been around for almost 40 years. It has several restaurants and delis, and it sells food through an online shop as well. In terms of size, it's got a much bigger turnover than Henryson Foods, run by Kate, who I'm travelling with in Dover. But in terms of types of foods, it is a lot more specialised and small scale. Fran Pomble, the buying manager, showed me around. So which products will be subject to checks?
All products that are considered medium risk. These are chilled products of animal origin, not ambient stable products. And in the case of cheeses, all the cheeses that are not pasteurized are going to be considered medium risk.
Okay, so what percentage approximately in terms of the food you import does that cover roughly?
I will say about 40%. So that will add complexity and that will add delays and uncertainty. So if a truck is put aside for the inspection, we don't know how long it's going to take for the inspection to happen. If it's going to be 24 hours, 72 hours. So that's going to make very difficult to plan stocks.
We asked the government, how long will these checks take? They told us they'd be done in a timely fashion, and beyond that time, they'd be released. They said as each port is different, these times may vary. I wondered if all this uncertainty has been putting pressure on the relationships that Fran has with Spanish food producers.
It hasn't suffered. In our own experience, it hasn't suffered. We have lost one supplier in all this mess. This is just one supplier, 170, 130. So it's not too bad.
But that particular supplier you lost, what would be the reason you would say you lost that supplier?
Because the UK market is not that relevant to them. So they can sell much easily in France or Germany, Italy and Spain than to the UK. So why bother is their answer.
That's almost painful to hear, to be honest.
It is. We keep relationship with suppliers for a very long time. They are partners, they are not suppliers. It's going to be more of a struggle to find new suppliers because one of the first questions that we're going to ask is, are you ready to export? And are you willing to go through all these hurdles with us if you're not ready?
Especially for smaller
smaller ones.
Producers,
especially if you think about a small artisan producer, they do everything. And suddenly someone fancy from the UK comes and say, I love your product, but you have to go through all these paperwork to get it to the UK. Do you have the time? Most of them will say, well, thank you, but it's not worth it for me. The UK is still a very attractive market, don't get me wrong. People love to be in London. It's a place to showcase their products, and it's still a very attractive market as a whole. Spain or the EU might not sell less food to the UK, but I think we struggle with the quality of food that we get in here. Big players, big industrial players, they'll be fine. They're used to it. They have the cash and the people to get ready for all this paperwork. But the smaller producers, the artisan producers, and the interesting producers, they will struggle. So we have to work our charm. And we will, and we'll be fine. But
so you have to be extra charming.
Yes. Yes.
But charm alone won't get your foods into the UK. As chef Owen Morgan, co-owner of Asador 44 in Cardiff, knows, the food programme were there recording just a few weeks ago.
We've seen huge direct impact for us in products getting knocked back at the border from our importers, and obviously then the huge financial costs and emotional cost to those people producing at source who are small producers producing with passion. To lose 250 kilos of incredible old ex-dairy beef. They believe they filled out all the paperwork correctly in a timely fashion, and for some unknown reason to them at this stage, they're saying, no, we need another 45 days to assess this. And I was like, well, products like that can't hang around in a container just doing nothing. So it's lost.
And there's more. Owen says the import rules means he's now unable to buy in one of the world's best cheeses.
Don't know if you remember the Supreme Champion of the World Cheese Award 2 years ago. That was for a cheese called Olividia from a company called Quesos y Besos, Cheese and Kisses. And it's a husband and wife team in Andalusia. And to go to those awards week, they had to shut down because there's only 5 people in the company making cheese. That's it. We use some of their goat and sheep milk cheeses, and they've had to stop because all but one of them is unpasteurised, and it's a whole new level of awfulness to get that through. So it's taken the wife out of production, and now she's just fully office-based, which is not what she wants to do because of dealing with this. And so for the time being, they've said, you know what, we won't be dealing with the UK.
Time and time again, I'm hearing this message. It's the very small businesses, both in the UK and in the EU, that are most seriously affected. After the referendum in 2016, one of the most influential voices, reportedly known in Westminster as Brexiteers' brain, was Shankar Singham. He's a lawyer specialising in international trade and a fellow of the pro-Brexit think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, although he himself voted Remain. I put to him that Brexit, for many voters, was about freeing the UK from rules, securing more free trade. But many businesses seem to now be tied up with far more restrictions and costs.
Assume that, you've left the EU, and we're not having a debate about going back into the EU, because frankly, if you are outside the customs union and the single market, then there's going to be customs process, there's going to be regulatory process, and all you can do about that is to mitigate it, to lower it as much as you can. If you look at the economy as a whole, so businesses tend not to look at the economy as a whole, they look at the economy of their own business, which is totally understandable. But if you look at the economy as a whole, consumers, businesses of the future, there's a gain that comes to that individual household from more liberalising trade agreements with other countries. There is a very much bigger gain that comes from your regulatory reform. So our economic modelling suggests that the regulatory reform gains are about double the gains from improving border barriers. And then you've got the mitigation of the border itself, and that will be a cost to GDP per capita. How do you resolve those trade restrictions with the EU? In the UK-EU TCA. Is the EU-UK TCA a very liberal agreement from a UK perspective? It is in some ways. No tariffs, no quotas on products going back and forth. But in other ways it isn't. And, there's not much on services. There's nothing on mutual recognition.
So businesses are too focused on their own business rather than looking at the economy as a whole? Well, is that what you're saying?
No, I think businesses, it is entirely right that businesses worry about their own economies. But a government is not supposed to simply aggregate what different businesses are telling them and say that's your trade policy or that's your foreign policy. It's up to the government to look at the whole economy.
But do you think the net effect is going to be better if we do it this way? Because having spoken to so many businesses, the end result that we're hearing from pretty much all areas is higher prices in the supermarket for European goods for the consumer. And less choice.
Yeah, so it depends, basically. If you don't allow... I recently did a discussion with Morocco, and we were talking about Moroccan tomatoes and Moroccan oranges and so forth, and actually you could bring those in very much more easily now. You've got to remember that the European Customs Union had very high tariffs to agricultural products. So the advantage of leaving it, obviously, is to lower those tariffs so that you can then bring in more choice and more products for consumers. But you've got to do that. It's not going to happen just by leaving the EU. You have to then do some things about this. Your question is a question about whether this was the right thing for the UK to do in terms of leaving the EU, which is, well, hey, it's above my pay grade to do that. But what I can tell you is if you are going to leave the EU, this is the way you have to do it in order to maximise your GDP per capita gain. And if you're not prepared to do those things, so for example, if you're not prepared to lower your tariffs to allow more products to come in from more different countries, to increase choice and lower price, if you're not prepared to do that, if you're not prepared to improve the regulatory condition that affects your farmers so you make them more efficient and more competitive, if you're not prepared to do any of these things, then there's no point in leaving the customs union and the single market. So you have to decide, the people of the country have to decide, are we prepared to do those things? Because if you are, then I believe, based on the analysis I've done, there are significant gains out there that we can get.
Shankar Singham also says there's more the government can do to take the pain out of this process for businesses.
Having a regime doesn't mean you have to check and control everything. It doesn't mean you can't have trusted trader schemes. DEFRA has an SPS trusted trader scheme that they are starting. So I could be a trader who is well known to the government authorities. Therefore, I don't need to physically check your goods. Maybe I require a little bit less information from you for those goods that are coming across the border.
Shankar Singham. Some of the gains might be for UK farmers. Tom Bradshaw, the new president of the National Farmers Union, has been critical of the way the government has handled Brexit so far, especially on the subject of trade deals. So, does he think the controls on imports will make things fairer for British farmers?
It seemed bizarre that the EU were implementing the checks across their side of the border, but we weren't checking anything coming in here. So there is an element of level playing field, but it is about making sure that we maintain our biosecurity. And that is the element that has driven us to call for these checks to be imposed. And broadly speaking, we welcome the checks taking place because I think everyone in the country wants to be able to access safe, affordable food.
What do you make of the way checks have been planned so far?
Well, at the moment, we still don't know exactly how they will be carried out. And I think they're talking about a slow rollout so that there isn't a cliff edge that suddenly creates a huge traffic jam at those inspection points, which could create big delays. So I think initially it's going to be rolled out quite slowly. We do have the concern that Severington is 20 miles from Dover. And what will happen for any loads that are supposed to be destined for the border control point, but that don't go there? What will happen to those loads? I know the government are saying, well, they won't be able to sell that product if it hasn't gone through the checkpoint. So, that should be deterrent enough. But I think that there's still a lot of this to play out yet. But the other concern is for our horticultural sector. They are saying that it's essential for our businesses that we don't let disease come into our glass houses. We carry out those checks on our business premises at the moment. Why do we need to carry out our checks at Sevington? Because they've already been doing the inspections at their business premises. It's essential for them that they don't allow disease into their glass houses. But they would much rather take responsibility for their biosecurity rather than risk there being any infection at the Sevington inspection point. So we've always said it needs to be the appropriate checks at the appropriate place. And that is different sector by sector.
Tom Bradshaw, arable farmer in North Essex and president of the NFU.
When 1993 came along, we had 140 clearance agents in Dover. A year afterwards, there was about 8 of us left.
As we keep heading west on the M20 towards the Sevington border control post, passing miles of lorries at a standstill, we start reflecting on the past.
There certainly wasn't as much traffic. There wasn't as much divergence of goods that we have now.
As an 80s baby, I don't have the memories of life before the single market, unlike customs agent Sandy, who witnessed all the changes directly.
The basics have always been there, and that's what we're returning to. We wanted to try different foods and different drinks and different bits of culture, I suppose, that we've had in our imports in the EU that's been free and easy the last 30 years. And whilst we've all gone computerised, the amount of traffic now going backwards and forwards still enables us to come to a complete halt that we're just coming up to at the moment. So,
if you both had to make a prediction for what you think is going to happen at the end of April, what would it be?
I think to begin with, a lot of things will get rejected on the paperwork front, and I suspect that DEFRA will quickly see that the rejection rate is way too high, and then somebody will say, stop rejecting so much, make it easier, wave a few things through, because also Brexit is still a political hot potato, and nobody in government wants it to be seen as a failure or particularly as a block to business.
It's interesting. One of the obvious visual ways we as the public see the border not operating as effectively as it could is massive queues. Do you think we're going to see massive queues on the 30th of April?
I think there's going to be queues going into Sevington if all the triggers are allowed to actually remain. But as I say, I think that the trigger levels will be reduced. They've got to be, because, as you say, to threaten the shelf life of the goods that are going to be on those trucks, businesses won't be able to take that.
So we've got a brick room, and then we've got a lactic cheese room.
At the Brindisa warehouse in Balham, founder Monica Linton shows me the cheese store.
Some of them we oil. So the Menorcan cheese there gets oiled once a week with paprika olive oil. The early decade was all about introducing diversity, bringing new flavours over. And so I had all that paperwork that I had to sort of pay an agent to deal with. Round about 91, 92, the need for that import agency work was not so necessary because Spain's membership became fuller. So then over the following decade, then in terms of the charcuterie and ham producers that we could work with, the quality improved from that day. So now we're slightly going backwards in that the big brands can cope and the smaller ones are finding it harder. So it's like the reverse.
Monica says the many different costs associated with Brexit have pushed up prices for customers.
And it seems bonkers, really, because, we're just across the water. You can buy the same thing in a French supermarket if you get on a ferry for, a European price. But in England, you have to pay a British price. So that differential, I think people will notice.
Generally, with all the changes coming up, do you think you'll continue importing at the same scale at which you have been?
What we're going to do now is we want to rebalance our portfolio a little bit, because the handmade artisan products are really important to us. And now we have to make much more of an effort to bring them in. So rather than being dissuaded to bring them in, we're actually almost energized to make sure we really help these producers who can't do it easily, make sure we get enough distribution in the country to justify the costs to them and the cost to us. So what we want to do is we want to actually drive that sort of mini, like hero products or artisan products within our portfolio much, much more.
Could any of the products you import be replicated in the UK? Could you make them here?
We could make some, and we might make some in the future, but it would always be limited by volume. You can get a sort of salt cod from Scotland, for example, that we could adapt to the cure that we like, potentially, but it would be very, very small amounts compared to the demand that we would want to meet and the prices that people might be prepared to pay. And labour in England is expensive as well, so you'd have the labour cost here. But with some categories, there is some sense in doing it.
I suppose the obvious comment would be, why bring foods in from Spain at all? Why not just eat British-made artisan foods?
Well, we do actually a lot at home. But again, there's certain things from the continent that you just cannot get here. Sheep's milk. Really, really, really healthy milk. Really healthy cheese. People are being encouraged to eat sheep and goats cheeses and consume those milks, but in Britain we just do not have the dairy herds to do that. Free-range pigs that run around oak forests. We don't have that many oak forests, and we don't have that breed of pigs in number. So, it's hard because some of the foods, I would say, from the Mediterranean, it's a very, very respected diet. It's health-giving. We can't replicate that here.
Has there been any benefit to the company from Brexit?
I would say categorically no, not to Brindisa. There might be to other businesses, but for Brindisa there's been no benefit whatsoever. It's almost like Brexit is completely opposed to, foreign food.
Monica Linton from Brindisa in South London.
So there's our first site at Sevington.
It's big site.
Yeah, it's massive, yeah.
We've driven from Dover to Sevington. We've just arrived. Took about half an hour from Dover Port. Could you explain, Sandy, what checks are going to take place here?
The facility, as you can see, is a set of warehouse-type buildings where they can take goods to be physically checked. And we're going to have DEFRA veterinary officers, plant health inspectors, all sorts of people on site.
But what are they actually checking for?
Well, we're talking about biosecurity and what's going to enter the food chain, seeds and that sort of thing. A small amount of fresh produce, but mainly we expect it to be frozen and chilled foods.
So this is essentially the border for our food security, which is taking place 22 miles away from the border.
Yeah, it's turned into the same thing for physical customs checks. Unfortunately, there's no control for a vehicle that comes from 11 miles away, the Eurotunnel, or 22 miles, the Port of Dover. If he's called to check, then he might eventually come here, or hopefully he eventually gets here.
Is this what we were expecting when we left the EU, taking back control?
I think that was always coming, but the cost wasn't expected, and the sheer infrastructure problems of what we're looking at, handling such a large volume of goods coming into the country.
What do you think on that, Kate?
Yeah, I have to agree with Sandy. I don't see that there is much food security value being added at Sevington because they won't be able to check that much of what's coming through. Hopefully, if you're working with good suppliers and, everybody's got certification and we're all doing checks, then in a sense that's reducing the risk for sure. But yeah, in terms of taking back control, I don't know about that. I think, we're just paying a lot of money and we're only checking a fraction of what's coming in anyway. So how valuable is the money that it's costing us to do all of this for the amount of checking that we're able to do?
Kate Wright from Henryson Foods. Back on my call to Brexit Brain, trade expert Shankar Singham, and it's end of term assessment time. Overall, how good of a job do you think has been done in the implementation of Brexit? If you had to give them a grade.
Gosh, that's a very big question that's well beyond the issue of import controls. So there are three big aspects of Brexit, I guess, that if you wanted to give the government a grade, you'd have to analyse. So the first one is, what does Brexit allow you to do? The first thing is it allows you to have your own trade policy. So it allows you to negotiate all these FTAs that we hear about. And on that, I would give them a reasonably good grade because they have been getting out and doing those negotiations. And for the most part, I think they've been getting good deals. And so I'd give them a good grade in that area.
So what, an A plus?
I wouldn't quite go so far as A plus. I mean, I would probably give them a B plus A minus for that area. Okay. And then you look at something like regulatory reform. This is the other area, improving your domestic regulatory position so that it's more competitive. This is one of the things that farmers are very concerned about, which is all the burden that they have to undergo. Could we just make things work better, faster, etc.? There, I think I would not give them a particularly good grade because we haven't seen a lot of that. We've seen a little bit now, more recently, but I'd probably give them a C plus, on that. And then the final area is managing your border. And that's what we're talking about here, which is how well have you managed, mitigated the fact of leaving the EU, which creates customs process, which creates regulatory process. How well have you handled that? And there are a couple of things that I think the government has done. One is you can, through the free ports that we have around the UK, introduce simplifications and facilitations that go beyond what you would normally be able to do to make it easier for goods to flow into your country and through your border. And there are, as I mentioned, a couple of trusted trader schemes that the government has come up with. But they could have done, I think, a lot more, and they could have done a lot more quickly. And so I'd probably give them a B for the border management piece of it.
So overall, not terrible. It's not bad at all.
Well, given the scale of the challenge, I would say it's not been bad. Could it have been better? Absolutely. But everything can always be better with hindsight. We still have ongoing issues that we have to resolve with, Northern Ireland and so on. And some of that's been very well handled, recently through the Windsor framework. There are improvements that need to be made, not least our agreement with the EU, which is up for a review in 2026.
What do you think of Mr. Singham's grades? Think he's a fair marker? Or could he have been tougher? Join the discussion on X and on Instagram. We are at BBC Food Prog. The Department for Food and Rural Affairs sent us this statement.
These border checks are fundamental to protecting the UK's food supply chain against costly diseases reaching our shores. Our new risk-based model has been designed to minimise costs and burdens for traders and consumers. They will have a minimal impact on food prices while saving traders and businesses around £520 million each year compared to the model originally proposed. We have worked extensively with stakeholders to help them prepare and will continue to support businesses of all sizes as they adapt to the new checks.
So, what now? This isn't the final part of the border controls jigsaw. There's more to come later in the year. And then there'll be a chance for renegotiations with the EU in 2 years. So more change on the horizon. For today, though, let's give our final few minutes to an enlightening chat I had with Catherine Bernard, a professor of European history at Cambridge University.
Getting Brexit done, as we now know, was far easier said than done. It's required entirely new IT systems, which have all taken time. The introduction of the border has been delayed 5 times. The government is now going to go ahead. It's somewhat surprising, actually, they're going ahead now rather than delaying until early next year, because it may be that there's a change of government at the start of next year, and they will have to deal with the consequences of any price increases which have been brought about as a result of the introduction of these charges.
And there's more to come, isn't there? There's more changes happening in October.
Yeah, the final stage of the introduction of our border takes place at the end of October of this year, when safety and security declarations will be required on all goods.
Monica Linton from the Spanish importer Brindisa said that she thinks Brexit is opposed to foreign food. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think we've all got very accustomed to having a wide range of foods from not just the EU, but from across the globe. And it's one of the most remarkable cultural changes in my lifetime. I grew up on Spam, and now my kids grow up on salami and prosciutto. We know that this is partly to do with our EU membership, but also there are goods coming from non-EU countries. We benefit hugely from Japanese, Indian foods. But all of those have got to come into the UK, and they all need to be checked because we want to eat safe food. The risk is that smaller importers who are used to being able to get their goods into the UK very easily will be put off by these charges, and so there might be less choice, but we will still be eating prosciutto and salami. It's just that we might not have the range that we had before.
Professor Catherine Bernard from Cambridge University. Thanks for listening. This programme was produced by Natalie Donovan for BBC Audio in Bristol and was presented by me, Jaega Wise.
From BBC Radio 4.
I just remember shouting and screaming, "Get off my sister!"
Life as we know it can change in an instant.
I was just punching frantically. I wasn't going to let it take away my sister if I could help it.
A single transformative moment.
I heard this engine sort of go past and I was like, what is that? And Mum had looked up into the rearview mirror and she went, oh my God, he's here.
I'm Dr. Sian Williams, and this is the programme that explores the most dramatic, personal and poignant stories from the very people who've experienced them.
I always passed there and said, "Hi, John. Hi, John." You've got to find some joy in the sorrow, You've got to find some joy.
Subscribe to Life Changing on BBC Sounds.